This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Hello, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to today's Economy Committee meeting looking at the impact of Brexit on London's economy. Could we have... So first of all, we've got a few items of business to attend to, but before I start, if we could just in terms of the mics and our guests, if when you're speaking, if you could just make sure, so if you look on the panel thing, there's a figure of the person. If you could just press on that, and then turn it off when you finish speaking. And also, if you need to adjust your mic, could you take it from there rather than there, because that sort of breaks them. Could we now have any apologies, please, Clark?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies for absence from Assemblymember Garrett and Assemblymember Boff.
Thank you. Could I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask members if they have any other interest to declare?
Noted.
Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on 13th of December 2023 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
And can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings as well as the additional correspondence received?
Noted.
Okay, we'll now move on to our main item of business, a discussion with invited guests on the impact of Brexit on London's economy. Joining us at City Hall today are Ben Brindle, researcher at the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, Laura Citron, CEO of London and Partners, who is Laura here? You are. Sorry, hello, Laura. Sorry, I've got something in front of me and I can't see because you're going to be here a little bit later, won't you? Thank you for being here now. Alex Conway, the Assistant Director of Economic Development and Programmes at the GLA. Sarah Hall, the 1931 Professor of Geography and Fellow of St John's College, University of Cambridge, and the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of UK in a Change in Europe. And Dennis Novy, Professor of Economics from the University of Warwick. Thank you very much, very distinguished panel, and I'm hoping that we will have a really interesting discussion. We're going to start off with the first questions, which I will ask, and they are directed to Sarah and Dennis. So the first one is, how would you summarise the impact of Brexit on London's economy today, and in what areas has there been a discernible impact, and have we had time now to understand that impact? Sarah, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. So I think most of the academic research from economists looks particularly at the UK economy and suggests that there's a negative economic impact from Brexit, although the extent of that is hotly debated. And I think as time has passed since the UK has left the EU, it's clear that it's very variegated in terms of geography and in terms of sectors. So if we look at London in particular, I think a key distinguishing feature here is the importance of the service sector in London's economy, which makes it quite distinct compared to other parts of the UK. And that's important because what the research is showing is that particularly services exports to the EU have held up rather more than we thought they would have done in the run-up to Brexit. There have been impacts on goods exports which do affect London. I don't want to make a suggestion that London is just a services economy. But again, the sort of specificity of the impacts is important here. So, for example, in goods, the research suggests that it's impacting smaller firms sort of further down the supply chain more than larger firms. So I think as an opening statement, I would say that it's variegated within a general context that has posed economic challenges to the UK. I think the other thing that's important to note is that we're trying to untangle here the impacts of the UK's departure from the EU alongside some really other profound economic impacts and challenges, particularly the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impacts of the COVID pandemic. And if you just take COVID, trying to untangle those impacts is quite challenging. In some ways, COVID has helped services. It's normalised online delivery of services in ways that just wouldn't have been thought possible before the pandemic. So in that sense, there's some evidence that that's actually helped, consultancy, IT consultancy, those kinds of areas. So that would be my kind of opening position.
Thank you very much, Dennis.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Yeah, so as an economist, I've done a lot of that research myself on Brexit in particular. And the summary I would give on Brexit is that it's very expensive. It's a very expensive policy adventure for the UK economy. And what do I mean by that? As a headline figure, I would say that the impact on UK GDP is something probably in the range of 3 to 4% of GDP. So that's an enormous amount of money. So what that means is if Brexit hadn't happened, or if we had had a very soft form of Brexit, the UK economy right now would probably be about 3 to 4% higher. Now, the precise numbers are still a little bit unclear, as Sarah was pointing out, but that's the headline number. Now, digging into this, why is that? Where does that impact come about? The biggest item, I would say, is costs for consumers. It's higher prices, it's inflation. And the first bout of that came about at the beginning after the referendum, when the pound exchange rate depreciated by about 10% during the night of the referendum. That was the biggest depreciation of any advanced country's currency in recorded history. And it's fed through to higher prices. And those higher prices come about because of imported products that become more expensive. So this could be food, this could be clothing items, and that has affected the average household in the UK by about £900 to £1,000 per year. This is a permanent cost. It happens every year. Ever since, we've had further increases in inflation because of Brexit. So they are unique to the UK. They did not happen elsewhere. And that is because of customs changes that were introduced. And the UK imports a lot of food in particular, and that's where some of the impact has happened. Now, in other areas of the economy, of course, it's not all about consumption and prices. There's been a negative effect on investment. And investment is very important for the growth, and especially productivity growth of the economy. A lot of that investment is because decrease in investment is because foreign companies do not perceive the UK as attractive anymore as they did prior to Brexit. And UK companies have set up subsidiaries in the EU to still be able to serve the EU market. So an example would be EasyJet. EasyJet is a British incorporated company, but they set up a subsidiary in Austria so that they can still fly within the European Union. That's one example out of many, many others. And also the uncertainty is really important to mention here. Uncertainty is somewhat a bit of a toxic influence for investment in particular. As you can imagine, businesses do not like uncertainty. And that's also had an impact on higher prices. That's also more evidence. We've also seen a bit of evidence on lower wage growth that we would have otherwise not have seen, and that's because businesses, especially in the manufacturing industries, have seen higher input costs, partly because of the exchange rate depreciation, but also because of difficulties in supply chains. And that has reduced the spending they have available for training, worker training, and wages. Now, in that context, I should say, as Sarah mentioned, most of trade is done by big companies. And the problem with Brexit has been because of the customs issues that are still coming in. Mind you, only in spring this year, the UK will phase in customs checks. So right now, everything that comes in from the EU essentially comes in the way it's always come in. And those customs checks are burdensome, especially for smaller companies. Now, these small companies do not trade very much because most of the trade is done by large companies. However, some of these small companies grow to be big. And that's a pipeline, and that pipeline is now being disrupted because of Brexit. So there's evidence of that, and that evidence comes from all sorts of countries, obviously the UK, but also other countries like Spain, Portugal, so we can see those negative effects. And finally, I should probably also comment on this question you asked, can we actually even say what the effects of Brexit are, given that we've had lots of other complications, COVID in particular. And my answer, a bit different from what Sarah was saying, would be yes, we can, because COVID is not something that uniquely happened to the UK. COVID happened to other economies as well, particularly European economies. And it's a bit complicated from a statistical point of view, but you can tease out the differences. Now, it will take a bit more time, and the detail and the precise numbers are still going to be debated for some time. But the overall headline is very clear. Brexit has been very expensive for the UK economy. Of course, that also extends to the London economy.
Can I go back to something that you said just a moment ago about the larger companies having subsidiaries, and you gave the example of EasyJet. That is just the larger companies who can afford to have subsidiaries. So what about the smaller companies? You talked about the fact that they're not able to grow in the way that they would because of Brexit. But what about the business that they're doing with Europe if they don't have those subsidiaries in European countries?
Well, the large companies have set up subsidiaries, or they already have subsidiaries. That's, for example, the case in finance. So if you think about some of the big banks like Barclays, HSBC, they've been operating across different countries for decades. For them, it's relatively easy to adjust. Perhaps that's one reason why the losses in the financial sector, particular job losses, are relatively minor compared to what some people had feared, probably in the thousands, not so much in the tens of thousands. The small companies, to put it bluntly, they just stop trading with the European Union. It depends a bit on the industry. So if you're on some industries that are heavily affected, seafood is a case in point. Chemicals, these are all highly regulated industries where you have a lot of customs checks. And the small companies, they stop trading, or they just don't grow, or they don't start. So this is precisely the pipeline problem that I mentioned, and that's particularly acute for manufacturing. For services, as Sarah was pointing out, the UK essentially is a world leader in trade and services, and this is also for your recommendations, I think, a really important point to press with the Mayor and the government, that the UK needs a strategy for services trade. And services trade is probably not as much affected as, say, seafood or chemicals, but the UK needs a strategy so that they can build on that. There are some problems in services. We've seen that, for example, with musicians in the cultural and the art sectors, where musicians cannot just work anymore like this for a gig, say, in France or Germany. So there are issues to be dealt with, but there's some hope that the UK could formulate a cohesive strategy for services trade.
Thank you. And in terms of disentangling the various issues that have happened over the last few years, you both have differing views. Sarah, you've said that you don't think that it is still difficult to disentangle at the moment. So can I just ask you this? Polling in December found that a clear majority of the British public now believes that Brexit has been bad for the UK economy. 63% believe that Brexit has been a factor in fueling inflation and the cost of living crisis. Why do you think they've come to this view, targeting in specifically on Brexit?
So I think that that's probably an example of where economics and politics become very closely entwined. So if we go back to what we know about why people voted for Brexit, it was, for many people, it was a vote of disquiet with the status quo in terms of how they were experiencing economic growth within the UK. And I think for some of the reasons that Dennis has outlined, it's fair to assume that people are experiencing profound increases in the cost of living, which have a Brexit element, may well have experienced kind of disruption in their travel plans, challenges in supply chains in their local economy. And for those reasons, I think it's fair to assume that voters reflect on what they were voting for and look at their lived economic experience now and see a disjuncture. And actually, I think this reflects quite a long history of the UK's relationship with the EU. I have a sense that if the UK's economy had been performing better, that figure that you've just quoted possibly would have been different, and people wouldn't be looking to blame Brexit quite so much.
Okay, thank you. You've both talked about the service industries that we have in the UK, and you talked about food as well as one of our major trading elements. Could I ask you both, has Brexit had any noticeable impact on the trading goods, both with the EU and the rest of the world, in particular for London-based businesses? So if, Dennis, you could start.
Yes, so any industry that's been hit is also found in London, but not always to the same extent. I mean, Sarah was pointing out that London is very services heavy. I don't think the difference between London and the rest of the UK is quite as stark. So the UK economy is about 80% services. It's somewhat higher in London, but it's not that this is an enormous difference. Financial services are very strong in London, but you also have a lot of financial services employment outside of London. So once you look a bit more closely in detail, the London economy is not that different, with some big exceptions like tourism, for example. So manufacturing is smaller in London, but there are some businesses that manufacture here. So we have Tate & Lyle, not far away from here. It's sugar. We have biscuit factories and so on. And yes, they have been affected in the same way as companies elsewhere in the UK have been affected. On your question as to why have people come to the view that you just pointed out, more and more people believe Brexit has been bad for the UK economy, is, well, it's complicated. People come to their views in different ways, but I'd say largely because it's true. The evidence is now there and people are feeling it. I should probably also declare an interest. I am also on the Economic Advisory Council of the British Chambers of Commerce, working with especially small and medium-sized businesses. And these are major employers for up to 6 million people in the UK, and people notice what happens in those businesses. They talk about the difficulties that they face. So it's a recent quote of a UK business that no longer goes to trade fairs in Europe. And the reason they say is European companies are no longer interested in them. and they don't approach them anymore, then we have all the problems with the red tape, this enormous red tape, which is very burdensome for small and medium-sized businesses in particular. That is very much a story for London businesses as well. And I think over time that trickles down and people understand the implications of Brexit.
Thank you. Has Brexit had any noticeable impact on the trading goods, both with the EU and the rest of the world, in particular for London-based businesses? So, Dennis, if you'd like, Sarah, if you'd like to start on that one.
So I think if you're looking at UK-wide trade more generally, I think it's important to put it in a context where the UK's trade intensity, a sort of measure of how open the UK's economy is to trade, has been relatively weak over a number of years. So there is that wider context. I think the key information which is coming out of academic research is the differential impact of Brexit on goods and services that both me and Dennis have alluded to. So here we've seen a greater negative impact from Brexit on goods exports, particularly to the EU, from the UK, less so on services. I think the other important point to note when you're thinking about services, and particularly financial services, is that UK trade between the UK and the EU in financial services doesn't take place in a vacuum. And I think it's really important to note the kind of growing attractiveness of the US in financial services in particular in recent years. And we've seen this with growing interest amongst firms in listing in New York compared to London. So I think one important consideration, particularly if you're thinking about action points, is to not lose sight of the UK's relationship with other trading partners in services in particular and financial services, and to kind of recognise that there are other growth markets that the UK historically has had very strong links with. So I think the recent agreement of a mutual recognition agreement between the UK and Switzerland on financial services is a really interesting thing to watch. Put simply, it's a kind of newer model of a financial services trade agreement that the UK has agreed with Switzerland, which makes it easier for UK-based financial services to access the Swiss market. That's really interesting because Switzerland is another major financial service centre internationally, one that also sits on the periphery of the EU. So I think when you're thinking about the impacts of Brexit on trade, and particularly in terms of services, it's important not to lose sight of what's going on both between the UK and the EU, but globally as well.
Can I come?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So I agree with everything that Sarah has said. I can make another point here that perhaps might be useful for your recommendations. You asked about London businesses in particular, perhaps London services exporters. One big issue here is the UK problem is we don't have the data. The data quality that is being provided for research is poor in the UK. So just not far away from here in Stratford, HM Revenue and Customs have a data lab where you can access the data. It's incredibly hard to get access to the data, and then those data that HMRC provides are not linked up with other data sets from the Office for National Statistics, for example. So if you want to find out what kind of companies are we talking about, how big are they, how much revenue do they have, how many employees do they have, what are the wages of the employees, who do they trade with, and so on, it's incredibly hard to link up. I work a lot with French data, and the French data is just a different world. So what we know about, I could tell you a lot about the companies in Paris. The amount of detail I could tell you about those, no one in the UK or anywhere could tell you that about London, because those data are behind difficult data protection walls. And I think that really needs to change, especially if we want to find out about Brexit. Another point about London and the rest of the world is an open question on Brexit is the issue of supply chains. Modern trade is no longer I produce something and I send it somewhere else, end of. That's not how it works. We have trade and intermediate inputs that crisscross borders, often multiple times, with companies all over the world producing different things, like Airbus aircraft is a big example of that. And what we don't know yet is whether UK trading relationships being damaged with EU countries because of Brexit, whether that has other effects on other countries outside of the EU. So if a UK company is no longer seen as a reliable partner in the global supply chain because the difficulties that are arising with the EU relative to other countries who do not have those difficulties, does it also make the UK less attractive for other countries that have nothing to do with the EU, like Japanese companies, for example? So that's one of the big open questions, and that's a data issue. It's very hard to find that out in the UK. So to summarize, I would just say Brexit is a bit of like a bleeding wound. It's not a gushing wound where blood is coming out in major quantities, but it's a small wound. And those wounds can sum up over time, but it's not sustainable and needs to be fixed. So a lot of the politics is also focused, say, on the trade and cooperation agreement, which will be reviewed next year. In my view, that's a bit of a red herring because it's essentially a non-committed, almost voluntary review, which has no hard meaning to it. But what does happen day in and day out is regulatory divergence. Every day there's new regulation coming in the EU in all sorts of industries, be it food, be it chemicals, be it toys, anything. And day in and day out, if the UK doesn't copy those regulations, there's a divergence. And that is a huge problem for British businesses. You have, over time, a growing divergence of regulation. That means British companies have to fulfill duplicate regulation. And recently, one of those examples was this UK CA conformity assessment that the UK government came up with to replace the EU conformity assessment regime that's been there for a long time. And of course, the UK has always had that as a member state of the EU. British business lobbied very intensely to avoid that, because for them, it's just two regimes of regulation that they had to deal with. And now the government recently, at the end of last year, said, okay, we're going to abandon that UK certificate. You can do it if you want to, but you don't have to. You can stick to one regime if you wish. That was very much what businesses want. So that's sort of performative Brexit, where you come up with differences and divergence for the sake of coming up with differences and divergence. That really has to stop. And that's what I mean by the bleeding wound. Instead of coming up with gung-ho, highfalutin trade agreements and all sorts of things that the country was promised over the years, I think what would really be useful is kind of the hard grind of work of trying to stop the differences and trying to make life difficult for UK businesses and their employees.
Thank you. Could I hand to Assemblymember Bukhari now for the question?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, I think that a lot of questions have been covered already in terms of what I was going to ask, and if there is anything else that you want to add in terms of the impact of Brexit on services, please do. But is there any particular sectors of the London economy that has experienced a noticeable economic impact of Brexit to date? If there's anything that you can add to what you've already said, but other than that, I think we've covered quite a lot already within this section. So.
One sector very quickly is, of course, education. A lot of us work in universities, so we at the University of Warwick, and I'm also at the London School of Economics, we have seen a big drop in students coming from the European Union. The obvious reason is their fees have increased. They used to pay home fees, and now they pay the foreign fees, which are a multiple of the fees they used to pay. So that's a big hit, and therefore the reliance on students from outside of Europe has increased.
We'll be covering that as well later on, so thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Assemblymember Bukhari. Assemblymember Clark.
Yeah, thank you for that. So just a minute ago, Professor Novy, you mentioned about financial services and the impact they're having, not just in London, but across the country. I wonder if you could expand particularly on London, how, this could also be for you, Sarah, as well, and how financial services particularly have been impacted by Brexit in London.
Yeah, so financial services is a strategic strength of the UK's economy, but essentially experienced a no-deal Brexit. So the trade and cooperation agreement like other free trade agreements, does much more on goods than it did on services. And this is because the EU single market is pretty revolutionary in terms of what it permits member states to do in services. So prior to Brexit, you could be a financial institution in London, based in London, and you had access to the single market through a mechanism that was called passporting. That was brought to an end when the UK left the EU and has been replaced by an equivalence regime. So equivalence works whereby if you're France, say, if you're the EU, you decide, does that country meet your regulatory standards in a particular part of financial services, and there's lots of different parts. And if you say yes, then you grant an equivalence decision. The UK adopted quite a liberal approach to equivalence and granted quite significant market access to EU financial institutions, and this also included a temporary permissions regime which allowed EU-based firms which were already working in the UK to continue to do so. The EU adopted a rather different approach, a more restrictive approach to single market access for UK and London-based firms. And so currently the UK has just one equivalence decision from the EU, which is significantly less than other major financial centres like New York, Singapore, for example. I think we might want to talk about what that one equivalence decision is in. It's in clearing, and it's been extended twice already, and there's a deadline of 2025 for that to end. So that might be something you want to discuss further. But if I just speak to the sort of generalities of that. So on paper, this, moving from passporting to one equivalence determination, there were some worst-case scenarios which were suggesting that you might see close to 100,000 financial and related professional services jobs leave London in particular for the EU when the UK left. And Dennis has already alluded to the fact that that hasn't happened. And the latest estimates are around 7,000 to 8,000 job relocations. So I would describe Brexit for financial services as being a long Brexit, in that it was quite clear early in the negotiations the sort of Brexit arrangement that would be available for financial services. So the sector got more notice in some senses as to what Brexit might look like compared to manufacturing. And that was because if you were going to end free movement, which the UK was clear that it was going to do, the EU was clear that you weren't going to be able to cherry pick parts of the single market access for financial services. So it's a long Brexit. There's more time to prepare. And as Dennis mentioned, the sector already had quite significant kind of cross-border bases across the EU. So it had a infrastructure that it could draw on to some extent to try and mitigate the impacts. So that being said, I think I would note that the job figures look flat rather than significant growth in UK financial services. So I'd probably sound a slight note of caution around that. And I think we're also seeing, there was a lot of debate in the run-up to the UK's departure about, would Frankfurt overtake London as Europe's leading financial centre? And it was framed rather in a sort of competition between different European centres. I think what we've actually seen is rather a picture of fragmentation, where different types of financial services activity have tended to cluster in different European centres post-Brexit. So it's not been that one centre has overtaken London or directly challenged London's financial services, but perhaps London needs to be better at recognising the kind of like specialist ecology that's emerging within the EU. So you're seeing banking relocations, for example, being clustered in Frankfurt, market infrastructure and clearing activity being clustered in Amsterdam, asset management in Dublin, and then I think some really interesting things going on in Paris actually around more of a kind of full service range of activities in Paris. So I think the impact on paper has been less than worst case scenarios would have anticipated. But I think what's unfolded in some ways is not exactly what was predicted, in that we've seen this fragmentation across Europe. I think as well the other side of the coin is, what are the advantages potentially for London outside of the single market in financial services? And here people would point to the ability to be more flexible in regulatory terms, potentially more nimble, and being able to tailor financial services regulation to the specific needs of London, as compared with needing to design financial services regulation that met the requirements of all EU member states. I'd sound a slight note of caution around that, because we know that London played a very significant role in shaping EU financial services regulation before the UK left. And I think there's some sense within the sector that the speed of regulatory change has perhaps been slower than it would have liked to have seen, given the lack of single market access. I mean, I'd say in the past kind of year, 18 months, there have been some strides made. The Financial Services and Markets Act would be a significant piece of legislation there, which essentially sets up the UK's post-Brexit financial services regulatory landscape. The agreement of the MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding between the UK and the EU on financial services regulation, I think is an important piece of financial services diplomacy. I think we're yet to see exactly what that might produce. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, the UK is beginning to explore relationships with other third countries, notably Switzerland.
That's really helpful. Dennis, I see you want to come in there.
Yeah, so I think financial services is really an interesting case. As Sarah and I were saying, the impact hasn't been that dramatic. It's about 1.3 million people in the UK that work in financial services, and the job losses in London for financial services are probably less than 10,000. So that is relatively minor. And financial services are interesting because you have really strong increasing kind of agglomeration effects. The pool of depth and knowledge both in the workforce and the activities in London financial services is just enormous. There is no one other place in the EU that can rival that. And I think that's one of the reasons why there has been this fragmentation. So Amsterdam has been picking off some of the equity trading, and asset management has gone to Dublin, but no one place has been able to pick everything off. And I think the UK banks in particular have tried to keep the high value added work in London. That's good news for the UK. That hasn't been lost. For example, M&A activity, that kind of work in the background is very labor intensive. That's where we generate value added, high wages, good jobs. But that doesn't mean there are not other places outside of Europe that can rival London, obviously New York. And I think New York has really benefited from Brexit, much more than European countries. One final thing on regulation, I think it's really important to understand how regulation works, especially anything that has to do with trade or international affairs. This is a game of the big guys. Regulation is done by the United States, by Europe, and China. Maybe India in the future. That's it. And the UK's fate from now on, despite all the talk about sovereignty here and there, is really to align with the EU. It's a bit ironic because the single market, including very much financial services regulation, trade policy, was really a UK strength. There's probably no other country in Europe that formed as much of that regulation as the UK. I mean, especially the government under Margaret Thatcher was really crucial for the single market. And in trade policy, that's definitely the case. Peter Mandelson was EU Trade Commissioner. Before him, there were other British trade commissioners. There's no question that the UK was the leading country in Europe. All of that is now out of the control of the UK. And if you diverge from that, you're just going to have trouble. So businesses in the UK are resisting that. They don't want that to happen. It's not in the economic interest of the UK. I think it's really important to understand the UK now needs to think much more like much smaller countries, but like Norway or Iceland almost. They're not as large as the UK, not even close, but qualitatively, they are now much more in the same boat as those countries. That's really important to understand.
It's really, really helpful, and that description of the UK making itself a smaller country, effectively, is a key point. Thank you both for your answers. I'll hand back to the chair because I know other colleagues have questions.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the next section, which is about immigration and free movement. Ben, I have a couple of questions for you. Firstly, how has the UK's immigration system changed since Brexit, and what impact has this had on immigration patterns to date?
So I guess in the broadest terms, what's happened is migration has become more restrictive for EU citizens and more liberal for non-EU citizens. So if we think about the immigration system we had prior to the points-based system that we have now, EU citizens benefited from free movement, had the same rights to live and work in the UK as UK-born citizens, and that meant that they could take any role in the labour market that they wanted to, regardless of the salary or the skill level. By contrast, under the previous system, non-EU citizens generally were restricted to graduate level roles. There's a few exceptions there, but in general, that was the case. Then now it's the same rules for both EU and non-EU citizens, and people coming to the UK to work need to have a job offer from a UK employer, and that job needs to be have skills which are at least RQF level 3, which is equivalent to the skills gained from completing an A-level. They also need to have a salary which is at the moment more than £26,200. That's set to increase to £38,700 later this year. There are some exceptions if the job is marked on the shortage occupation list, although that's also going to be revamped. But most roles need to be paid at least £26,200. And this is very much reflected in the net migration statistics that we're seeing at the moment in terms of these rule changes. So in terms of work migration from EU citizens, that's fallen. It was minus 67,000 in the year ending June 2023, whereas for non-EU citizens, work migration has increased and was 144,000 in the same period, the year ending June 2023. But it's important to note that work is only one aspect of net migration. So if we think about non-EU net migration specifically, the total number in the same period was 768,000. So work migration comprised only about 1 in 5 migrants in terms of that overall number. And the other groups, which include the dependents of workers and the dependents of students themselves, people who have come on humanitarian routes from Hong Kong and Ukraine, and family migrants as well. All of these groups are able to work in the labour market, and so while they might not be part of the formal work migration system, they still play a big role in the labour market and in the economy.
Thank you. Are there any particular sectors of the economy that have been impacted either positively or negatively by changes to immigration patterns since Brexit?
In terms of those sectors which have been most impacted, I think the most indicative way to look at this is to think about the share of jobs in each industry which are no longer eligible under the work migration system. The Migration Advisory Committee provided a breakdown fairly recently in October of last year. And the three industries with the highest share of jobs which are no longer eligible are hospitality, wholesale and retail, and manufacturing. And then if one looks at London specifically, there's not too much data for specific regions, but HMRC data does break down into different regions. I had a look at these three industries, and what we've seen across all of them is that the number of EU people, citizens working in these sectors, has declined between December 2019 and December 2022. But at the same time, the number of non-EU citizens working in these industries has risen. And in the case of hospitality, that's offset the fall in EU citizens, this increase in non-EU citizens. In the case of wholesale and retail and manufacturing, it's actually reversed it entirely. That is to say, there's more non-UK born people working in these sectors in December 2022 than there was in December 2019. Then in terms of, I should say, in terms of what's actually going on here, I think there are two plausible explanations, one I think more likely than the other. The first is that the increase in non-EU citizens is happening through the work migration system, so in these more skilled and better paying roles, such as, let's say, managers in retail, for example. However, if we look at visa grant data, it doesn't seem to match that increase that we've seen. So what I think is probably more likely, and the bigger driver of the two, is that this increase in non-EU citizens is happening with those groups outside of the work migration route, the dependents, students, etc. Then on that question of which sectors have benefited, thinking about work migration specifically, I think overwhelmingly it's the care sector of the visas which were granted in the year ending September 2023. About half of skilled work visas were for the care sector. It's sort of overwhelmingly becoming the case that visas under the skilled work system are going to public sector jobs, and particularly health and care, while, for instance, some of the changes which are set to be implemented are going to make it more difficult for the private sector. And so there's a real contrast and some divergence there in terms of the ability to use the immigration system, at least with regard to work.
Thank you. Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. My question is about, I don't like this phrase, lower skilled sector. I'd rather call them crucially skilled people. Actually, that would probably be a better way of defining it. But what impact have the changes had on the labour supply for those particular roles that are considered to be lower skilled, and the sectors that depend on these roles? Because there's been some really interesting research from academics, Jonathan Portes and Jonathan Springfield, that estimated that the end of freedom of movement has led to a shortfall of 330,000 workers in Britain. Now, this must have an impact. What kind of impact is that having on the long term for London's growth and productivity?
Firstly, I would say that I agree in terms of what you say about low-skilled migration. Yeah. It's one way. I guess it's dependent on the amount of time it takes in terms of training and education, but there are other skills which don't count as skilled under that definition. So I'd agree with you there. In terms of the impact on sort of lower paying roles would be a better way of describing it, given the changes in the migration system. It's difficult to say, in part because there's a sort of lack of data, and then also the changes that were implemented were done so at the same time as the pandemic, and so disentangling the two is a little tricky. But as I said, it does appear that sectors which previously were hiring EU citizens in quite large numbers now have sort of shifted their hiring patterns to non-EU citizens. Yet, as we see, vacancies are still very high, at least by historical standards. That, to me, what I think it suggests is that actually migration isn't a key driver of the difficulties hiring that we've seen, and that it may play a role, but other things such as, say, the change in labour market behaviour following the pandemic play a much bigger role in terms of vacancies. On the question of the idea of this EU emigration, previously it was thought that during the pandemic there was an emigration potentially of up to 1 million EU citizens across the entirety of the UK. It now, according to the latest ONS estimates, seems to be the case that there wasn't this emigration occurring until January 2021, or that first quarter of 2021. And so that suggests that rather than the pandemic, it was potentially the change in the immigration rules, sort of the added bureaucracy and restrictions, then meant that there were more people leaving the UK than coming to the UK. But to go back to the initial point in terms of, where have there been those impacts on labour supply, and the fact that migration I don't think has played too much of an impact, I think that taps into a wider point that migration is one way of addressing vacancies in sectors, but it's not the only way and might not necessarily be the most effective way. So, for example, employers could improve pay and conditions in roles to make them more attractive to workers who are already in the UK. Another thing would be automation. to reduce the number of vacancies that are required. But then in terms of which of these are actually being done, there is a little research. There's some surveys of employers to ask what they actually are doing in reality. It doesn't appear that automation is the case, at least not at this point. I guess it can take time to innovate and change processes. At the moment, it is the former of those that's happening a lot more. This change in pay, this change in flexibility of roles, that seems to be, at the moment, how employers are responding.
Been a lot of work that we've done on, the skills gap that you kind of were implying there, and the government have had some approach to this. What do you think is the government's reasoning when they've got a staggered approach to raising the skilled worker visa income, for example, threshold over the course of 2024? Now, is it to allow the opportunity, perhaps, for the government to actually have a U-turn and potentially, could be a damaging policy? What effect do you think is this having for the skills visa itself? Has it, will it continue to have on pre-existing skills gap in London's economy an impact? Will it benefit? What's the impact of that particular approach from the government?
Of the increase in the skilled worker salary threshold? And
particularly the staggered approach. That's what I'm more interested in.
What do you mean with the staggered approach? Sorry,
it's not a one approach. It's a slightly changing policy that seems to be emerging bit by the government.
Would that be the? Sorry, I think that might be the family threshold, because the family threshold is starting. I guess that slightly separate, so if I come on to that in
it's based on politics more than economics, I think. That's my impression. What would you say?
There was certainly opposition to the family threshold, and now the final increase is set to happen in 2025, which could well mean that because of the election, if there's a change in government, that it's not enforced. So, it's quite possible that won't actually happen to the full extent that it's suggested it will at the moment. In terms of the skilled worker salary threshold, on the face of it, it looks quite dramatic, this increase from £26,200 to £38,700. But I think it's actually less dramatic than it first appears. Firstly, because a lot of this increase is accounting for inflation since it was first introduced. So the Migration Advisory Committee recommended that each year the threshold be increased in line with inflation, but beyond a small increase last year of a few £100s, that's not been the case. So, some of this is simply accounting for inflation, but then also in terms of the scope as well, there aren't too many jobs which are going to be affected. So if you think about the visas that were granted in the year ending September 2023, that was about 208,000 skilled work visas. About half of those were for the care sector, and the care sector has been exempted from this change. So those roles are going to be unaffected, at least as far as the skilled worker threshold is concerned. There are restrictions on dependents, but that's a separate issue. So of this other 50%, we then have a further 20% of roles which have salaries set according to national pay scales, things like doctors, nurses, higher education, teaching professionals, for example. And because the salaries on these jobs are set according to those pay scales, they too are exempt from the skilled worker salary threshold. So again, they're unaffected. And that means that where the impact would fall is on jobs which represented about 30% of visa grants. But then if we look at those in further detail, you see that a good number already are paying more than the new 38,000 threshold. Jobs such as IT professionals, accountants, and so they should be relatively unaffected as well. Where it's going to fall, therefore, is on middle skill roles, particularly if we look at the visas granted on butchers and chefs. But it's these types of roles where there probably is going to be quite a significant impact. One question there would be, and which we're still waiting for information on, is what the revamp or the replacement for the shortage occupation list will look like. So the current shortage occupation list has two real benefits to it. First, there's a going rate which employers have to pay workers when hiring from overseas via this route. those occupations added to the list can have a 20% discount on that. Now, that's announced that it's going to be scrapped, so the benefit which we'd expect to continue, otherwise the list wouldn't have much of an impact, is that employers can hire for under the general threshold. That is to say that once the new threshold is in place, that they will still be able to hire for under £38,700, but we're still waiting for details on that. And then, if I might just turn to London specifically, quickly, I think many of the impacts that we've seen, or the trends that we've seen, such as, for example, as I say, that the fall in EU citizens and rise in non-EU citizens working in the labour market, much of these things are the case in London as the rest of the UK. But where I think that there are specific impacts, firstly, that this fall in EU citizens was the greatest in London, as sort of a share of the number of EU citizens that were working in December 2019. But then turning to the system that's in place now, London generally has higher skilled roles, at least more so compared to the other areas in the UK, and it also tends to pay more for the same roles. So there are likely to be fewer jobs bound by the salary and the skill thresholds compared to other areas of the UK, and so be less affected in that sense. However, on the flip side, the cost of living in London can, I think, act as a disincentive. So there is a higher vacancy rate for nurses in London than other parts of the UK, and evidence looking into this suggests that it's because the cost of living is higher, earnings don't go as far, and so moving to other parts of the UK is more appealing.
Thank you. My last question is, how is London likely to have been impacted by changes to immigration patterns since Brexit compared to other regions in the UK?
Well, I think they're sort of the sort of real differences. Otherwise, the picture's sort of broadly the same. I think it does come to that sort of key aspect of the fact that generally roles in London tend to be higher skilled or better paying, and so there should be less impact in that way. But then the flip on, the cost of living, things like that. Wouldn't expect much of an impact on, say, wages, for example. There's a sort of a fairly large body of academic evidence now which shows that immigration has very minor impacts on wages. Sort of at most, it's unevenly distributed, with wages increasing slightly towards the top of the earnings distribution, which in this case could apply more to London, and falling slightly towards the bottom of the earnings distribution. But these impacts are very small, and so the trends we've seen are the same, and I think the labour market impacts are going to be fairly small as well. But that's the case not just for London, but for the UK as a whole.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hirani, did I see your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on some of that questioning, really, just on some of the rhetoric and policy that we've seen in the last 2 years, in particular around this. You mentioned about the change in the wage limits and numbers and the shortage occupation list. Unfortunately, and I say this as a politician, you're seeing some elements of politicians playing on the rhetoric of fear, and it's really having it's getting to a place where the reasonable or rational debate around this issue is not possible all of the time, when people are playing on people's fears rather than addressing them. It's resulted in significant damage to our economy, we're hearing, and society and social cohesion as well. Given the negative impact, what do you feel, Ben, needs to be done to maybe start to try and address or tackle that?
So can you clarify your question slightly there? Sorry, I didn't.
Yeah, so just with what we're seeing with sort of the negative and toxic debate around immigration, it's obviously having an impact, and the net result or the end result is maybe what we're seeing, or what the panellists have been explaining about the impact on London's economy and the UK's economy. How would you suggest that we can try to maybe tackle and address some of that to get more of a positive narrative and engagement around the topic?
So I guess this is very much what the Migration Observatory tries to do. Hopefully we succeed to some extent. And I think it's some of the key things that we try to do is to try and bring more sort of evidence into the debate. So sort of looking a bit more in depth at policy and what's sort of actually happening, for example, on things like the labour market impact and public services. I think often there is a difference between sort of public perceptions and then what we actually see in evidence that's produced. Another thing as well, I think, often migration is talked about in very broad brushstrokes. Not only sometimes migration and asylum, those topics can be conflated, but also too in sort of specific topics. So in the context of work, for example, if in opinion surveys people are asked what they think about migration levels and are they too high, too low, there's quite some support for migration levels to be reduced. But then if those same people are asked about specific occupations and specific types of migration, generally the reception is more positive. So thinking about different types of occupation, for example, the only one which people on balance say they wouldn't like more of are bankers. And then in terms of sort of groups more widely, so Ukrainians command high support, students do as well. And so I think that talking less in sort of these broad brushstrokes and some of the nuances would be important for the debate, and sort of bringing sort of facts and evidence into that too. It's obviously quite difficult. There are a lot of actors in the migration debate, lots of opposing interests in places. But I think to the extent that that can be brought in, it should be, and yeah, that's certainly what we try at the Migration Observatory.
Thank you. Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. Today, Brexit has been described as a bleeding wound. We saw after referendum hate crime on the rise. We've seen the toxicity in our politics. There are no Conservative Assembly members in the chamber today. It feels like they've fled the scene of the crime. But their one argument was that this would deal with the fact that wages weren't rising. But we've already heard from Professor Novy that there's no discernible difference on wage growth. From what I understand that you just said, there has been wage growth at the very top. So the richest people have benefited from Brexit, whereas the poorest are seeing their wages fall, if anything. Can I just check if that's a correct characterisation, and why did they get this so wrong?
I should clarify that slightly. Some of this research took place before Brexit, some of it's over the period. We're still waiting for some sort of afterwards. Also, these impacts are sort of incredibly small. So in this particular study, for example, which is reflects other studies as well, but we're talking sort of 1-2 pence an hour. So it really is a very small impact relative to sort of tax policies or education policies and things like that. So technically, yes, there's been a slight increase in the sort of distribution of wages, but it's very, very small.
But it wouldn't be accurate to say that Brexit has created higher wages for people?
I don't,
across the board, I mean.
This research seems to be both before and after Brexit. It's across sort of developed economies. These results generally get found. It seems to be a similar pattern. So I'm not sure I could say too much of the role that Brexit has had on changing this equation.
Understood.
In a particular way.
And is there any work that's specific on wage growth for migrant workers and wage growth for UK citizens who weren't migrants?
There's not too much in terms of breaking this down. A lot of the academic evidence focuses on the UK born, but one thing we sort of do know on this is that migrants do tend to be more impacted by immigration and more migrants arriving in the labour market, essentially because they tend to have more similar skills and so are more likely to be in direct competition. If you compare UK-born workers and arriving migrants, UK-born workers tend to have more in the way of communication skills, and so they are more likely to be in those type of occupations, whereas migrants, at least when they arrive due to things like not having the correct qualifications or language ability, tend to be in sort of more roles which use manual intensive skills more, and then they tend to transition later on as well. But we would expect migrants to be more impacted by immigration on the basis that they are more similar.
Absolutely. And of course, it's not all about wages. Has there been any research or data done around attitudes or working conditions?
Attitudes have improved since since the Brexit referendum. I think part of that might have been the fact that immigration was considered as being under control. But then, while the Brexit process was taking place, but then also, during the pandemic, I think things were looked at slightly differently. And so, as I say, when we look at specific types of groups, there is this fairly positive perception of migrants. It's when we are in these sort of broader brushstrokes and thinking about migration as one whole, like that, that I think the perceptions are more negative. But yeah, since Brexit, they have opinions have become more positive, seen in surveys.
Thank you. And Assemblymember Bakari before alluded to the threshold rising for the spouses. What impact could this have if this continues to rise on London's economy?
I mean, it doesn't have too much of an impact in terms of the economy, either for London or for sort of the UK generally. I think where the impact is, it's on people's personal lives. If you're looking to bring a spouse over or already living with a partner who's there on a family visa, not having these rule changes coming in, that's going to have a significant impact on your life if you're sort of caught within those changes. It could lead potentially to separations of families. That children, for example, can be seen as extraordinary circumstances as a reason for somebody to not have to leave the UK, but it's not always the case. And so there is that possibility. Unlike sort of a small increase as well, it's quite difficult if one is earning £18,600 to have their salary increase to £38,700 by next year. And so there could be a quite high number of people that are caught in this net. In fact, comparing the old threshold, the 18,600, to the 38,700, which it's set to reach by next year at present, it's about 75% of people earned over the old threshold in 2023. That number falls to 30% now. And while that might be less the case in London, because as I say, people tend to earn better, it's still going to be a lot of people sort of caught in that, in the scope of those changes.
Yeah, it's horrendous as people's lives, isn't it? I'm going to move sections, but it's just to check if anyone's got anything they want to say about free movement or immigration that's not been said. It's a very open question. Professor Novy. Yeah,
just something very basic, because also, Mr. Rani, you asked about the toxic debate on immigration in this country. I think it's important to say that the UK is not a particularly high immigration country. The UK doesn't have that much immigration. It's sort of in the middle of the pack. So if you look at the data here right in front of me, OECD countries, the share of foreign-born people as a share of the total population in the UK is 14%. That is the same as in the United States and as in Spain. That puts the UK in the middle of a pack. So it's much higher in Estonia, Norway, Germany, Belgium, Ireland, Iceland, Austria, Sweden, Canada. It's 21%, for example. Israel, New Zealand, Switzerland, Australia, Luxembourg. Their immigration is a lot higher than the UK. So it's just not true. However, what does, I think, is very important for the public debate, not just in the UK, elsewhere, is the population has a pecking order as to what kind of immigrant they like and what kind of immigrant they do not like. I know this is quite gruesome and quite blunt, but if you look at the data on this, for example, there's a YouGov poll here I have. This is asking the British people, this is from 2020, what are your top 10 countries and what are your the bottom 10 countries in your view? The top 10 countries, according to the British people, are New Zealand, Canada, Australia, the UK, Spain, Italy, Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, and Denmark. So you know what kind of countries these are. What are the top 10 worst countries, according to the British people? North Korea, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Libya. So these are all Muslim countries. Then Russia, then China, and then Somalia. So if you ask other countries, if you do that sort of poll in France or in Germany, you get a very similar response. But I think that is behind a lot of the immigration debate. It's not so much about immigrant, it's about where does the immigrant come from? And that is particularly toxic. But from an economic point of view, I think we also have to recognize that immigrants subsidize the local population. This may not be a very winning argument on a political side, because if you tell native British people, oh, it's so foreigners or foreign immigrants that pay for you, that doesn't tend to go down well at all. We've seen that in the Brexit referendum. But I think that's sort of the thing we have to keep in mind. It's very uncomfortable, it's quite gruesome, but that's what people think.
Yeah, this is so important. When I think about the leadership in this country, we've got Rishi Sunak running around saying stop the boats and conflating that with migration. We've got Keir Starmer yesterday doing a Nigel Farage tribute act saying you've lost control of the borders, as if we're being flooded with migrants. Why do you think these people aren't making the connection, overriding the racism with actually, and I think it's fair to call it racism, especially when you list those countries. Why do you think the economic arguments aren't piercing through? This might be the million-dollar question that you have to reflect back to a politician, but do you have any thoughts about it?
Well, I'm not a politician and I'm not elected, so I'm not going to expound on that in any detail. What I would say, though, is that we've learned that lesson more broadly in the entire Brexit referendum campaign, is that when it comes down to it, economic arguments are trumped by other, call them culture wars or cultural arguments. So with the economy, it was not a surprise, and it was widely debated prior to the referendum that Brexit would have costs, and those costs would be borne by the British people. Also, of course, by the EU, but to a lesser extent. And that is not what decided the vote in the end. That's where I'm going to leave it.
It's a grim place to have a break, but thank you for the honesty. Thank you.
Yes, interesting place to leave things. So if we could break now for a few minutes. So if we could be back by 3:15, please. And panel, if you need the facilities, Jack, I'm sure you can show. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, if we can now go back to the next part of this investigation, which is about foreign direct investigation, and going back to Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you very much, Chair. Laura, if I can turn to you, please. Has there been a noticeable change in levels and patterns of inward investment since Brexit? I'll just get you to pop your mic on, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought it might be helpful to just start by giving some context on what foreign direct investment to London typically is, and how, as London and partners, we work with foreign direct investors, because that hopefully will give a bit of context to the perspective I can share. And we've heard fantastic data from our colleagues on the panel, and I can share some data, but also more of a practitioner's insight from our work with hundreds, if not thousands, of investors. So I'll focus today specifically on foreign direct investment, by which we mean international companies who come to set up a new operation in London. And that's obviously distinct from other kinds of international investment into London, which could be capital investment for the built environment, it could be investment into financial products and so on. But let's talk about foreign direct investment, which is companies setting up. So typically, the clients that we work with as foreign direct investors are scale-up companies. They're in the innovation-driven sectors, so they're research and development intensive. They tend to be making their first move outside their home market. So if they're from Bangalore or from Shenzhen or from Silicon Valley, this is their first move into an international market. Not always, but typically. And they tend to be growing very fast. We focus on businesses in 5 key sectors where London has real competitive advantage. So that's life sciences, fintech, financial technologies, enterprise software, green and clean, and creative technologies, things like immersive experiences and gaming and stuff like that. If we look at all of foreign direct investment into London, about a third of those projects that come into London, we support them. They come through London and Partners. And of those, about 65% are what we would call contestable, meaning that they were thinking about going somewhere else and they ended up coming to London. So that hopefully gives you a sense of the bit of the market that we can see very closely. So if we look at what's happened to FDI pre and post Brexit, FDI to London was growing before Brexit, and it's continued growing since Brexit. But it's growing more slowly than in the rest of Europe, or certainly than Western Europe. And that's both in terms of the number of projects and the size of the projects. And what we've seen over the period is that the average number of jobs that are created by an inward investor when they come into London is smaller than the average number of jobs that they would have created before. And that's different in Western Europe, where those job numbers have been growing on average per project. But within that, and similarly to what we've heard from colleagues, there's a lot of difference in what's happening. So just to unpick that story a little bit. The differences between sectors. By and large, we're really talking predominantly about services here anyway, but within services, the heavily regulated sectors have been more impacted than the less regulated sectors. So life sciences in particular, and financial services that we've heard a lot about, have been more impacted than, for example, a gaming technology or an immersive headset or somebody who has a carbon accounting technology platform. Those have been less affected because there isn't the same regulatory barrier that there is for the more regulated. We're also seeing that the nature of foreign direct investments changed because investors are adapting to a new situation. So I've mentioned already that the projects are smaller, and that potentially partly reflects the desire to invest in the UK and the level of risk. But it also reflects the fact that, particularly post-pandemic, companies feel much more confident doing business virtually. And so in order to trade in London, you don't need to put as many people in London as you used to. So previously, if you were, say, a US company and you were going to expand into the UK, you might put in a team of, let's say, 10 people. Now you might think, well, I only really need 5 sales and marketing people on the ground, and the rest can just sit virtually and work with them online. So there's something about reducing the size of the projects. We've seen more M&A, so mergers and acquisitions, than before, by which I mean that an international company, rather than thinking, I'm going to come to London and set up my own subsidiary, they now might more say, I'm going to buy a London-based company that does a similar thing to me, because that's going to be less friction post-Brexit of having to overcome all the barriers myself. I'll just buy a company that's set up here. We've also seen some businesses that were already trading in Europe who've set up a small operation, a subsidiary in the UK, in order to continue to be able to trade with the UK after it left. But that hasn't been a big positive, because those tend to be very small, what we would call brass plating operations. So you just need to have a subsidiary, but you don't need many people working in it. So to summarise, overall, there's growth. The growth is lower than in our competitor markets. And there's quite a lot of sectoral difference within that.
Thank you. That was really extensive and really interesting. In terms of that, I hear you that there's still growth happening, but the growth has slowed down, and also the size and the projects are smaller. A similar question to before, but can you distangle that information from COVID and also the war in Ukraine? I don't know if it's the same answer, because you've already said that in Western Europe they haven't seen that loss of growth.
So it's difficult, I think, to do that quantitatively, but I can give you my my perspective from the market. COVID actually hasn't had a particularly significant impact on foreign direct investment specifically. It's obviously had massive impacts on other parts of the London economy. Because most of these businesses are high-tech service businesses, what we saw was in the immediate 6 to 8 weeks when lockdown started, there was a complete freeze, and all deals came to a standstill. They quickly adapted, worked out how to keep going, and actually, we saw 2021 was a record-breaking year for venture capital investment in technology. So I'd say COVID minimal from an FDI perspective for London and the kinds of investment we have in London specifically. The bigger impacts which we would have to disentangle from Brexit would be the war in Ukraine, and particularly its impact on inflation and therefore interest rates. So it's partly the inflation impact, but these companies by and large are backed by venture capital, and high interest rates has led to a very significant drop in venture capital investment, which tends to be the fuel through which these companies expand internationally. So that has been very significant. Increased competition. The rest of the world hasn't stood still since Brexit, and we've seen really strong increase in competition, to some extent from European cities like Paris, but really strongly from Dubai and Singapore. And then the US, with the Inflation Reduction Act, acts as a complete magnet for investment in anything green and clean technologies. And so we're seeing that the competition from the rest of the world, independent of Brexit, has grown in that period. And then the final factor that I think we need to some extent disentangle is the impact of London and Partners' own response on foreign direct investment. Because quite a significant share of foreign direct investment comes to London because of our support, and quite a high the majority of that is contestable, meaning that it might otherwise have gone somewhere else. The fact that London invested in us to be able to respond will have made a difference to the outcome for London. And so before the pandemic, we didn't have any offices in Europe. We weren't working in Europe proactively with European investors in that way. We set those up in 2018, so that was part of our post-Brexit response. But we also, for example, expanded our footprint in India, which is one of the really big post-Brexit opportunity markets. And so if we were trying to pull out what's the effect of Brexit been, mixed in with that is how did London respond to Brexit to mitigate some of the impact?
If our Conservative colleagues were here, they would say to you at this point that they don't think that London Partners are proving that that money is only coming to London through London Partners work, but I won't rehearse those arguments because they're not here. So
well, if it's helpful, Assembly Member, the government recently did a review of foreign direct investment led by Lord Harrington, which looked at foreign direct investment across the UK. And Lord Harrington's review recommended that the whole of government should use London and Partners evaluation methodology because it is the most rigorous.
I'm now glad I asked. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Polanski. And can I just say, we probably shouldn't suggest that they're going to say something, as they're not here to give, any members are here, those members are here to give a response or a right of reply to that. Thank you very much. So next is Assembly Member Clark.
Oh, thank you, Chair. The question I was going to ask has been asked, but has been answered. But I'm just going to come back to Laura because you've all been giving excellent responses, but particularly with regards to just your view. Despite all of this, what's interesting is, despite the challenges brought forward by Brexit and COVID, but particularly by Brexit, it's interesting that businesses are still choosing London, and to me, there's an obvious reason for that, and that it's the best city in the world, obviously. I'm just curious, just ahead of Christmas, the Time Out had said that London was the world's most popular destination for Christmas, and to me that felt quite just symbolic of how London is still competing on a global stage. That people, you can travel anywhere you like, and they're choosing London. I'm just wondering, from London and Partners' point of view, why is that London, despite the government making us a smaller country, less important, why are we punching so far above our weight?
So you're absolutely right. From a foreign direct investment perspective, London is still the number 3 city globally after Singapore and Dubai, which is a huge achievement. And any investor, when they're looking at where to go, they're always weighing up pros and cons. And the fundamentals of London remain hugely compelling, which for these types of businesses are access to customers. These businesses go where the market is, and London is one of the biggest clusters of decision-making headquarters of buyers in the world. And if you're selling directly to consumers, so you have a more retail product, the UK with 60 million people is still quite a big market. What's particular about London is it's a very digital, fast adopting market. So if you've got some new app or piece of software, you can launch it in London and people will tend to have rapid adoption. So the market is great. They come for capital to raise funds because we are a globally leading financial centre. They come for talent because we have some of the best universities in the world, really deep and broad talent pools, and that's one of the big drivers, particularly for these types of foreign direct investors. They come for a supportive ecosystem. So we have fantastic professional services, incubators, accelerators, all these different support programs to help these entrepreneurs to do well. And they come for lifestyle and values. They come because London is a place where they feel they belong, that they're welcome, that they can have a good life if they're going to relocate, and that their talent will want to be there. So all of those factors drive, and regulation. Having predictable and open regulation that supports innovation is another key driver. And then they look at all of those pros, and I think you would struggle to find an international investor who wouldn't want to come to London, because it is clearly a real draw. The question is, for some of them, will the frictions and the costs or the risks or the uncertainty outweigh the potential benefit?
Helpful, thank you.
Thank you, Assemblymember Clark. So moving on to the next section, which is about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Assemblymember Hirani.
Thank you, Chair. So my questions are mainly to Alex, and the first is on the amount of money that is being received through the UK Shared Prosperity Fund by the GLA. How does it differ to the amount that was received through the European Structural Funds?
Thanks, Assemblymember. Well, the London share of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund was £144 million over 3 years. Now, it's not quite comparing like with like, because you may have heard me say before, when we talk about the European structural funds that London receives, and which are just coming to their final end in the next, we're paying the final claims in the next couple of months. That was a 7-year programme worth around over £1 billion, actually, half EU money and half match funding, but you have to bring the match funding. But a crude way of looking at it is to say that the UK SPF is approximately half what we were receiving before. If you average out the EU money around 90 million quid a year, the UK SPF is well short of that. And a significant thing there is when the government first talked about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund back in 2017, they said it would replace European structural funds and be of the same value. And in London and in other parts of the country as well, it has to be said that has not been the case. We only have half what we had before, and we've also lost local enterprise partnership funding. That's been worth several £100 million over the last few years, and that funding's been wound up as well and not replaced.
And what sort of impact has that had on the GLA in terms of what you can invest in, what you can't invest in? What would you say has been scaled back as such as a result, or opportunities that you might have liked to have invested in but haven't been able to?
That's a good question. I mean, with European programmes, we could support a much wider variety of projects, for both. So there was more going on in London. Whether it was about sort of providing advice, guidance, and support to businesses, or indeed loans or equity to businesses, helping people not in education, employment, or training into education, employment, or training. We had a greater volume of projects going on. I think from my point of view, when you have these different kinds of projects, you always learn from experience. Some things work brilliantly and you look to replicate them. Other things don't work so well, but you learn lessons from that as well through evaluation. So there's much less. And one of the things that we've had to concentrate on, we've worked very closely with Laura and the team on this, is, well, when you've got less funding, you've got to think about how you use it in a sort of concrete way. And we've been working with London and partners and boroughs and other partners to make sure that we get best value out of the funding, the smaller pot of funding that we have.
Okay. In terms of the GLA's role and responsibility in actually managing the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, what is the difference compared to the previous scheme?
Well, it's actually quite similar. It's probably the first thing I'd say, and that's a good thing, because the GLA had a unique role within England in relation to European programmes, in that we were what's called an intermediate body. It basically meant that government devolved responsibility for the funding to the mayor and to my team, whereas in other parts of the country, European funding was managed by teams of civil servants. So we had a unique position there. One thing that some members may recall we were worried about going back a few years was that government would remove that kind of control, and we'd see more of these kind of top-down bidding regimes, the Levelling Up Fund, the Towns Fund, like that, where decisions were basically being taken by ministers in a rather mysterious and unaccountable way. When the UK Shared Prosperity Fund was introduced, we were therefore glad to see that it was devolved to local authorities. I mean, there are 256 lead authorities with responsibility for UK SPF. Most of those are district councils with £1 million or so each to spend in their areas. But some of the combined metropolitan authorities, Birmingham, Manchester, lots of Cornwall, do have bigger allocations. In London, we have the biggest single allocation at £144 million over 3 years. But my team is managing those programmes in much the same way that they manage the European programmes.
Okay. Dennis, did you want to come in on UK Shared Prosperity Fund? No? Okay. I also sit on the audit committee, and one of the issues that came up there was about the government portal for reporting and exchanging information on UK Prosperity Shared the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. You're chuckling already. It isn't working as such. Has that now been rectified or not?
They've got it sorted, I'm pleased to say, Assembly Member Hirani, for colleagues' information. And again, this doesn't reflect terribly well on central governments, to be honest, but part of this new programme, of course, is that they need to get information from these 256 authorities in a orderly way. It's something the government had so far failed to do. We kept being encouraged to download lots of information onto spreadsheets or through apps that then crashed and didn't work. As of last week, our Chief Finance Officer was able to upload that information. So with about 1 year to go in these programmes, on a 3-year programme, they seem to have cracked it.
So year 2 into a 3-year programme, you can get the information on it. It's been a shambles, as we've been hearing on that particular committee. I'm just going to go into the particular allocations as well and look at, so according to the information I have, it says that £38 million has been allocated to the people and skills, and of this 25 million is being awarded to the 4 sub-regional partnerships to coordinate activities with boroughs. How does that work in reality from the work that you're doing? So do you have sort of direct oversight into what that's actually achieving?
So we will do. So the important thing to bear in mind about the people and skills, so there are 3 tranches, strands of UK SPF funding, which we may come on to later. One around communities and place, one around supporting local business, one around people and skills. The odd thing about that £38 million for people and skills, and I think I may have said this to the committee before, is that for reasons that the government simply never explained, they only allowed this funding to be used in the financial year that's about to start, 2024-25. In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, they're explicitly allowed to use that funding over 3 years. I can honestly not think of any rational reason why in England we were told you could only use it for 1 year. It's obviously not good programme practice to run 1-year programmes. What the people and skills team, what the community and skills team within the GLA who are responsible for this funding have done very sensibly is look to in advance say, well, where are there skills and employment programmes already happening? And of course, the 4 sub-regional partnerships that you mentioned are already responsible for some quite successful European Social Fund-backed skills and employment programmes. So there's 25 million quid there that we're basically saying we're going to use to help economically inactive, unemployed adults access work. Worse, again, I'm afraid a bit of a sad story in terms of unhelpful interventions from the Department for Work and Pensions in this whole area, where we told them, 2 years ago what we were going to do with the money. They came back a few months ago and said, oh no, we don't, although they've already approved it, they effectively backtracked on that and said, no, we're not happy. Anyway, we had a further set of negotiations and it all got sorted out. But more of an example of government not acting in a very joined up or helpful way. So in truth, we'll have to come back in sort of March 25 and tell you what the outcomes are. What I can say is that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel with this time-limited, relatively small pot of money. We're trying to build on what's already worked in relation to skills and employment.
Okay, and just on people and skills, so it says, according to my briefing, £11.75 million was made available for an open competitive call, which closed in October. That's right. So do we have the results of who's won their bids? Again, it's a team separate to mine within GLA, but so it's been more than, the expectation is it will be more than fully utilised. Shortlist of projects is being finalised. Successful projects should be notified next month, and delivery will start in April, as I've said. So we'll keep you posted on that. We should be able to advise the committee if it's helpful in the next month what the outcome is. That would be, I think. So just on that, would you be able to provide a list of the projects through that are going through the 4 sub-regional bodies, as well as
yes.
The successful projects from the open calls to this committee?
Yeah, I mean, we've got that information we've got now. The 30 million, I think, is going through the final stages of the due diligence process and so on.
Okay, so moving on to the second strand. So according to my briefing, it says £40 million is allocated to the communities and place. So can you give us a flavour of what that funds and what you're hoping to achieve from that as well?
So that's, again, and this is a slightly sort of new approach that we took, when we were asked by government to draft a UK Shared Prosperity Fund implementation plan, which I think we've shared with the committee before. We had to do that in sort of double quick time in 2022, and the sort of agreement we reached sort of in partnership with boroughs was that we would give that money out. We didn't go through having a sort of open competitive bidding round as we've done with supporting local business. The money was allocated in its entirety to boroughs in return for sort of what I'll broadly call regeneration related outcomes, including capital expenditure. That money's all been allocated. The money's coming out the door. The results are coming in terms of what they're spending on. But you're talking about 33 different sets of activity here, and it is quite broad. So I'm saying, again, unlike sort of European structural fund programs where you can only spend money in very specific ways, there's, I think it's a sort of welcome boost to hard-pressed boroughs' bank accounts in terms of being able to undertake some of the sort of, high street regenerative style activity, capital funding for community assets. So it's being used in a lot of different ways. The outputs are all summarised in the UK SPF investment plan, which we can sort of share the details. But in terms of sort of individual projects, we can maybe supply some more details about what individual boroughs are up to. If that's useful.
I think that would be helpful, especially I think maybe speaking for those of us who are constituency members. I think it obviously would be interesting for the list members as well, just to know what's happening in every borough and what they're doing with that pot of money.
It's probably worth saying, from a management point of view, I think our role at the GLA is to ensure that all 33 boroughs are getting that money out the door. And conversations we've been having with London Council saying, if there's any sense that we have that boroughs are not getting that money, so we've allocated the money to boroughs are getting that money out the door. If there's any risk it looks like that's not happening by March, I think we'll be ratcheting up our monitoring activities here to make sure that happens, because we want the best possible story to tell any future government about why more of this funding should be devolved in the future.
Sure. And then I will naturally move on to the first round, which is supporting local business. And it's £62 million allocated to this strand, of which 30 million through an open competitive call to 28 projects. So again, I think happy for you to sort of supply us in writing what those projects are and where they're taking place as well. Obviously 13 million also provided directly to boroughs to support business support activity. We give details of that as well. I'm going to turn to Laura next, because £19 million of that is obviously allocated to London and Partners to develop and expand the London Business Hub. So could you provide more, could you just explain details about what the hub is providing, what it's going into? Do you have more funding outside of that 19 million, which is going into the hub as well, and what are you hoping to achieve from that?
Thank you. So that 19 million...
could you use your microphone as well?
Sorry, that 19 million is in two chunks. There is one which is for, as you say, the continuation of the London Business Hub, which I'll come back to, and the rest is for our work in the high growth sectors. So the money covers both the work supporting London-based businesses in high growth sectors to trade, and to a lesser extent indirectly supports foreign direct investment that we've touched on. And then the work with the London Business Hub is much more focused on micro businesses in local communities. So it's supporting both types of business. The work supporting the London Business Hub builds on the London Business Hub programme that had been run by the GLA for several years, and also a pilot that had been run by the GLA called Wayfinder. And we've combined those two previous programmes together into a new programme called Grow London Local. Grow London Local exists to help entrepreneurs who run smaller micro businesses in London to get the support that they need to make their households more financially resilient. Because we know that large numbers of business owners in London don't get any support with their business. In fact, under 20% of entrepreneurs are getting support with their business, and yet if you get support, it improves the outcomes. And our disadvantaged communities are particularly facing higher barriers to getting access to support. So why is that? Because people don't know where to find it, because it's really complicated and fragmented, the ecosystem for business support, because it can be expensive, because it's not convenient, it's not available at the right time or the right channel, because they feel like it's not for them, it's not for people like them, it's maybe not available in the right languages. So Grow London Local is a signposting service to connect micro businesses at scale with service providers, with an aim to significantly increase the uptake of business support. Because London has lots and lots of business support provision, some of which is really fantastic, but not enough businesses are actually taking advantage of it and using it. So Grow London Local has two channels. One is that we have teams of advisors who are in communities face to face every day in partnership with boroughs and local business improvement districts, chambers of commerce, universities, colleges and so on, community groups, meeting businesses face to face and doing diagnostics where we say, tell me about your business, what are your ambitions, how can we help you, and then referring them on to support providers. So that's the in-person channel. And then the other aspect is digital self-service, where anyone can go online, do a kind of little quick diagnostic online, and then it says these are the different services that might be relevant or you would be eligible for. Okay. So that's the Grow London Local service, and it's currently in its second phase of pilot. We've rolled it out across over half of the boroughs, and it will launch formally at the end of this month and have a full rollout to all boroughs by the end of this financial year.
Okay. Thank you. That sounds like a really valuable service. I think it would be worth us also as Assembly members referring people in our areas to and businesses that come to us as well who need that support, I'm sure. Just on the teams of advisors, just is there a sort of what's the criteria for support? How does a business come forward, or how does an individual come forward to say that they would prefer face-to-face? They may have gone through digital already and want a bit more, let's say, hands-on support.
So we're engaging with, we're finding and reaching out to these small businesses in lots of different ways. And once we've done the formal launch later this month, we'll be marketing everything from outdoor posters to lots of digital, highly targeted ads to doing lots of community outreach. But broadly speaking, the digital service is for everybody, and it's really a mass offer. And the face-to-face, we are trying to keep as much as possible for our underserved communities, because there's obviously a limited number of in-person diagnostics we can do, and we're keen that those financially vulnerable entrepreneurs get access to them first, which is why we're doing very targeted community outreach where we know that we've got significant numbers of micro businesses that are financially vulnerable. So we're reaching out to them. Literally, we've got teams out doing door knocking. We're working with local community groups, as I said, through various different partners, and would really welcome the support of any Assembly members. Yeah. Please do put us in touch with local community organisations or directly with entrepreneurs that you think would benefit from the service.
Thank you. Thank you. Alex?
Just to add, again, Assembly members will be aware, in his 21 manifesto, the Mayor talked about having a sort of single front door for businesses to access business support, and essentially, this is the means by which we're looking to do this. This is what we've been working on for the last few years. And to come back to some of the UK SPF funding, you mentioned earlier that some of the money is going to sort of boroughs for business support. Again, that's about boroughs also being able to augment the offer so that as many people as possible are kind of aware of the options, be they face-to-face, online, whatever, of the sort of business support offer, from advice and guidance to funds and so on.
Okay. And Laura, you mentioned that the face-to-face and the teams working locally are in operation in half of the boroughs. I think if you could supply us details of the boroughs that where people can today get support. I recognise sort of end of financial year they'll be open to people have access across all of London, but if we have information of who's able to receive it now, that would be helpful as well in writing.
Yeah, we're happy to provide support across all boroughs now. We're just not doing proactive outreach across all boroughs yet. We're very keen that once we start doing really proactive outreach in a local community, that we have a full mapping of what the support is available locally. Because to your point, Alex, about a single front door, through the single front door, the vision is you can access everything from big national programmes that are run by government to things which are run at a pan-London level and funded through UK Shared Prosperity Fund, to support from a borough, but also support from private sector, from local business improvement districts, chambers of commerce, FE colleges. And so we want to be sure that when we start sending people out in a local area, we're really able to refer to local services. And so what takes the time is building up that very local ecosystem. But if in the meantime people want to speak to an advisor, they can register online and we'll call them back, and that's available now.
Okay. I'm going to ask this question to Alex, but actually if anyone else has anything they'd like to say on my next question, feel free to come in. And it's on the future of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. So what would you like to see a future iteration of the UK SPF looking like, and what elements would you like to retain, and what would you like to possibly see changed?
In fairness, I'd say my biggest issue with UK SPF is not the nature of what it supports or how it works, but the quantum of funding. So I think, going back to work that's happened under this administration with the London Finance Commission, and actually the previous administration as well, under the London Finance Commission, have all kind of said that in order to make a real difference in this area. We need to see kind of proper devolution of a big single pot of funding, whatever you call it, and ideally a pot of funding that is like European programmes, is available for sort of 7 years, if that's not possible because of the way the sort of Treasury works, but at least 3-year programmes well in advance, not 3-year programmes that are only finalised 1 year into that 3-year programme. So I think we'd like to see, spending money, doing something along the way that we're doing at the moment, but expanded. And it's worth drawing the committee's attention to the fact that we're hitting a cliff edge pretty soon in March 2025. Civil servants, of course, are aware of this. We're aware that the general election has been penciled in for the autumn. I think we need to sort of step up the reminder that we can't be in a situation where all funding for sort of business support and skills and employment funding just stops in March 25 because people forgot about it. Fair to say that informally civil servants have kind of suggested that obviously there are ideas on the table for potentially extending programmes for a further year while government whatever government it is thinks about what comes next. And I think that's something where we're going to need to continue to lobby quite strongly if we don't want a gap in the important services that Laura was just talking about.
Just on that quantum of funding, so is there work happening in the background, and this could be from you or other people who work with the funds across the country around, for how much £1 invested, this is how much is recovered by the Treasury as such as some of that work happening? It just makes, if the evidence base is built up, hopefully a case can be made that's a bit more, let's say, stronger.
So I'd say that there's probably sort of 3 bits. So one, there's the evaluations that we already have about the success of kind of locally managed programmes over nationally managed programmes, and there's a very good story to tell, certainly in relation to European Structural Fund programmes on that. Secondly, there's some work, and the National Audit Office and others commented on this late last year about the sort of wastefulness of the government's separate pots of money. So I think this is one of our points. You don't even necessarily need to increase the amount of funding overall in the UK, but if you just, instead of handing out money in penny packets for, a new initiative around, as the government's been doing, around public toilets, a new initiative around seaside towns, all managed by groups of civil, if you just hand this money, devolve this money locally in one big programme, actually you could immediately honour the commitment to equal the size of European structural fund programmes without any new money from the Treasury at all. So I think there's some quite powerful arguments to be made to central government along those lines. Of course, we'd welcome further funding as well.
Okay, great. Before I hand back to the chair, does anyone have anything they want to add on UK Shared Prosperity Fund? No. Thank you.
Thank you. We're almost at the end, and I have the final question. As part of that final question, I'm going to ask you all, panel, to a couple of minutes, just from your perspective, what has been good and bad about Brexit for London, and then what would you like to see both the government and the Mayor of London do to address the challenges and the opportunities of Brexit? So, if I could start with you, Ben.
I think in terms of what's been good or bad, it's really a mixed picture, essentially. It's going to take time to adjust. I don't think it's necessarily possible to see quite what the impact has been, the change in migration just yet. We often seem to have a pendulum as well, certainly in the past few years, where rules are tightened and then liberalised, and so the extent to when it will actually settle, I think, is could be a few years before we actually get a better picture of that. I think one thing that I would say is just in thinking about vacancies in the labour market and the role of immigration is just to remember that while migration is a reasonable way of addressing those, it's not the only way, and that there's a suite of policies outside of migration that can be used in tandem with immigration policies or separately from immigration policies altogether. And I guess just one final thing is that in thinking about work migration, it's not just those people that come on work routes, but generally the overall migration. Many of those non-work people also play a key role both in the labour market and in the economy more broadly.
And is there anything else that you'd like to see the government and the Mayor do to address any of those issues?
the Migration Observatory doesn't do policy recommendations, so I can't say anything specifically. But I think that there would be more stability if there were one direction chosen, and sort of policy is always going to need to change because how migrants respond to certain policy and businesses and things like that. So there's always going to be responding to events to some extent. But I think to travel in one broad direction, regardless of what that is, would give stability and certainty from which businesses and policymakers can work around, more generally.
Thank you. Laura.
Thank you. It's not London and Partners' role to take a position on whether Brexit is good or bad, but to, in a very practical way, respond to do our best for London in the context in which London finds itself. So for us, some of the challenges that Brexit have created have been around having to fight much harder for our inward investment, and we've responded to that by putting our teams into Europe, by focusing on those really big contestable projects, and by expanding our presence in the markets outside of Europe. And we've also tried to make the best for London of opportunities created by Brexit. So, for example, supporting London-based companies to grow into those markets where there have been significant post-Brexit free trade agreements. So, for example, Singapore and Australia being good examples of that, where we're seeing real appetite from London-based companies to expand, so trying to support that. Like Ben, it's not my position to make policy recommendations. The Mayor has been supporting our response to Brexit, both in terms of its challenges and its opportunities. And I know that if my clients, both London-based and international, were sitting here, they would say from government, certainty, predictability, and working to Professor Novy's point on regulatory divergence would be priorities.
Thank you. Alex.
Firstly, I can't resist having a go at the challenge to come up with something good. So I'll just say that maybe people can't blame the EU bogeyman for decisions around immigration or rules and regulations that in truth were always decisions that national government was able to take, and maybe people will start to understand that a bit better. Ultimately, as a GLA officer, just to sort of state the obvious, the Mayor's views around Brexit are well known. You're going to hear a bit more at the Mansion House speech tonight on that subject, as trailed in the media today. And worth saying, you've already heard from academic colleagues here, a lot of thoughts around the effect that Brexit has had, which I'd broadly characterise as negative, though to different extents. And one thing that we at the GLA have just released today are the sort of updated reports from Cambridge Econometrics on the effects of Brexit. Again, saying that the impact on the UK's GDP may be 2 to 3% sort of lower overall, with the risk that percentage gets higher sort of over time. Really just reflecting what you've heard elsewhere, and that's also exacerbating those labour market shortages in London-based sectors that previously relied on an inflow of European workers. I think we're mindful that it's not enough to sort of bemoan the problem. We also have some work which I hope we'll be able to share with colleagues somewhat fairly soon, which we've been doing with colleagues from UK and a Changing Europe, around some potential ideas for mitigating the effects of Brexit. And to some extent, I don't want to steal the thunder of it because we'll share it properly in due course, but, at one end you can say, well, rejoin the EU, and another, you might say, as the Mayor has said before, well, we should consider rejoining the single market or the customs union. But I think this work is a little bit focused on what might be the out of the possible in terms of the very hard Brexit deal we have at the moment. Are there ways you might start chipping away at some of that? So I hope we will have some ideas that we might be able to share with the committee quite soon on that.
Thank you. We'll look forward to that. Thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, so as for other panellists at UK and Change Europe, we conduct research, and we try and use research to provide helpful advice to policymakers, but we don't make policy recommendations. And therefore, it's not for us to say if Brexit is good or bad. But as a researcher, I think I've been clear on what I think the economic impacts are on the downside. But I do think it's forced researchers and policymakers to take a long, hard look at the persistent strengths and weaknesses of the UK economy, and has kind of focused attention, I think, on kind of persistent issues around relatively low productivity, high regional inequality. And I think that is good in terms of research terms, but also in terms of policy terms. In terms of the kind of UK's relationship with the EU in the future and London's role within it, I think the research suggests that the economy is really calling for stability, certainty and strategic direction. And particularly my own work focuses on services, so I'm going to kind of focus a little bit on services. But I think, on this question of strategy, we hear quite a lot about, where is the UK on industrial strategy? I think there's potentially room to think a bit more about what the UK's strategy is on services, and particularly London's role within that. I think that's a really thorny issue politically for the UK, particularly following the 2007-8 crash, where talking about financial services strengths in London was quite tricky. And there's been a kind of policy turn towards thinking about towns. We've heard quite a bit about that today, and levelling up. I think if you don't think about what the research shows are the UK's strategic economic strengths, which are services and which are important in London, there's a real danger that levelling up could end up levelling down. And I do think that you need to integrate the position of London in services in the UK in kind of economic policy making for growth in the UK. I think that's one big area where there's scope to advocate for London's position. And I think the other is to be realistic about what might be possible vis-a-vis the UK's relationship with the EU, and particularly what London might need in that picture. And Alex has alluded to some work that the UK and Changing Europe is doing here, and I don't want to rehearse it in detail, but I think one of the key things is to be clear about there are a number of important dates coming up in terms of the UK's relationship with the EU. So a TCA review in 2026, the GDPR adequacy decision has a sunset clause in it such that adequacy wouldn't be maintained in terms of data flows with the EU if the UK was not deemed the same as the EU, broadly put. And there's this equivalence decision on financial services, all within the next 2 to 3 years. So I think being clear about what the UK would like to see from those in those different spheres is important. And I would just like to emphasise that I don't think seeing the TCA as the point at which Brexit is renegotiated is a very effective way of doing that. I think Dennis noted this, that you can't hang a lot on the TCA review. It's quite unclear, and indeed I would suggest up for negotiation as to what the TCA review actually is. I think what is clear is that the Brexit which was negotiated met a lot of the strategic aims for the EU on its strategic strengths in goods and manufacturing. The UK arguably met less of its strategic asks on services, which, as we've said, are particularly important in London. So I think it will be important to think about what might be possible within the confines and the operation of the TCA for London's economy. And I draw attention here to 2 areas where I think it's important to focus activity. One is really understanding regulatory divergence, because regulatory divergence isn't just the UK opting to do something different. It could be the EU changing direction and the UK not moving in the same direction. But equally, regulation applies to areas that weren't really being regulated at the point the UK left the EU. And I draw attention here to AI. London is widely identified as, Europe's AI capital, and within that, London, the figures I've seen are that 70% of AI activity and corporate activity in the UK is in London. But that's obviously an almost an entirely new area of regulation. So I think accurately understanding what's happening in terms of regulation and how the UK decides to sit in relation to the UK, to the US and the EU is going to be really important, not just in areas that are already regulated, but in new areas which could be real potential strengths for London and the UK more generally. I draw attention to technology, AI and the green transition here, I think, has been really important areas there.
Thank you very much. Finally, Dennis.
I think Sarah's summary was excellent. I 100% agree with everything that she said. I'm speaking as an economist, as a researcher who has looked at the data in a hard and cold way. And the good things about Brexit, I think, is an increased realism to understand where we are in this world and what we can do, what we cannot do. That's a really important thing that I think a strength potentially we can work from. Specifically for the London economy, whether this was intended or not, I think this increase in immigration, especially immigration from outside the EU or Europe, is probably going to be a big strength for the London economy in the future. This might take many, many years to come. But arguably, London is the most global city in Europe, perhaps in the world, and I think that will benefit London tremendously because of all the talent and expertise, and it can draw from that. There are certain sectors of the economy that have benefited from Brexit, but it's very easy to be flippant about this. For example, if you were planning a career as a customs officer, then you can probably benefit from Brexit. Yes, though there are some of these isolated incidents, but overall, the economic impact, I'm talking about the economy here, has been bad. It's been an expensive event for the UK economy. It's been costly for businesses. It's been costly for people. And it's just not helping the UK economy. That's true for the UK, but it's also true for London. And in terms of what I would wish we would have in the future is more predictability, less uncertainty. That was previously mentioned by other panel team members. Stop doing foolish things. We talked about divergence here. Regulatory divergence, in my view, is the big #1 issue. Brexit is not done. It's continuing every day. That's what I meant earlier when I referred to Brexit as a bleeding wound. Stop it. And the future has to be the UK will be somehow in the orbit of the EU. It doesn't matter whether you're Conservative, whether you're Labour, Green Party or Lib Dem. This is just the future of the UK economy. And I wish politicians strength and courage. The art of the possible was mentioned before, to do this in a way that they can take voters with them. I think there's a big political problem in this country. 52% of voters voted for Brexit in the referendum in 2016. A lot of them might be disappointed by now. They feel that they were lied to. And how can we take this 52% of voters along with us? Right? The Labour Party is very concerned about them. The Lib Dems even are not talking that much about Brexit anymore, presumably because they are competing on some of the seats where a lot of people voted for Brexit. So that's the art of the possible. So it's whether it's alignment of the single market or rejoining the customs union or having like lots of bilateral deals, Swiss style, that will be down to future politicians. But I hope we can have this conversation in a sensible, objective way without a lot of the noise and the sound and fury around it. I really wish that we can go down that route. And very much along the lines of what Sarah said, I think it's important for the UK to have a strategy, thinking about what are the strengths of the UK economy, and I think that's services for sure, and especially trade in services. And London is well placed to benefit from that, exactly along the lines that Sarah outlined. I couldn't agree more with that. And I also hope that across parties we can have a consensus there as to what the strengths of the UK economy are and what policies could support that strategy for the future.
Thank you, and an excellent note to end this investigation on. Thank you very much. So we've now come to the end of our investigation. Thank you very much, panel, for your incredibly insightful responses to a very timely investigation into an issue that does deeply affect London and Londoners. The majority of this committee wanted to go ahead with this investigation, so thank you for your input this afternoon. If I can ask, if you could just stay for just a couple of minutes, we'd like to take a photo after I've closed the meeting, so I've just got a little bit of business to finish first. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion? With regard to the work programme, can I ask the committee to note its work programme?
Noted.
And the date of the next meeting is going to be on the 6th of February 2024 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent any other business, so I will now conclude today's meeting. Thank you very much.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.